The Atlanta Falcons dominated the Saints with a four-man rush. We'll break down the film to show why that means their young pass rushers are trending up.
You are Locked On Falcons, your daily Atlanta Falcons podcast. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Welcome back, everyone, to another illustrious episode of the Locked On Falcons podcast. I am your humble host, Aaron Freeman. And of course, Locked On Falcons is your daily Atlanta Falcons podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. And of course, the Locked On Podcast Network is the number one sports podcast in America, which means it's the number one in the world, which means it's the number one in the galaxy until those Zorbians come for our throne. But we were watching you, Locked On Zorbia. And we can't help but thank all of you Earthlings and you Terrans, you humans that have made the Locked On Podcast Network the number one sports podcast network in the galaxy, right? Our species is winning, okay? And, we call you Earthlings. We like you as the everydayers that make Locked On Falcons and other shows like it across the network your first listen each and every day. And all you got to do to become an everydayer is subscribe and follow for free on YouTube or wherever you listen to podcasts. So today's episode, we are doing an all 22 review of the Falcons Week 12 win over the New Orleans Saints. We'll spend quite a bit of time talking about the Falcons pass rush, focusing on the performances of their young pass rushers like James Pearce Jr., Ruke Orhorhoro, Brandon Dorlus, what that means for what their performances against the Saints means for the coming weeks, as well as potentially the years beyond. We'll talk about Tyler Allgeier outshining Bijan Robinson. Does that mean, or at least is outshining him in terms of under center usage, does that make Bijan more expendable? And we'll talk about the idea of, is a Bijan Robinson trade potentially on the horizon in the future? And does this game sort of potentially become the first domino to get that to fall? So we'll address that. So let's jump into the pass rush. Basically, I could throw a bunch of numbers at you, but the ones I'll focus on is the Falcons were consistently able to win, as you well know, with a four-man rush, as we've been discussing on this podcast. My charting, the Falcons blitzed only about 17% of their plays. All five of their sacks came on non-blitzes with four-man rushes. And going into this game, nearly 75% of the Falcons' sacks this season were with them rushing five or more. Going into this game, essentially the Falcons had a bottom five pass rush when only rushing four this season, and that obviously changed in this game. And of course, the question we've been asking since Sunday is this one data point, or is this the beginning of a trend? Now, based off of the information we have today, I tend to believe, again, that it's more of a one-off. Not because it's not possible that's the beginning of a trend, but again, we have 11 games telling us, 10 games telling us it's, the blitz is the key behind the Falcons pass rush success, and one game telling us it's not, and it's the individuals winning that is the key behind the Falcons pass rush. And again, how that balances, you can figure it out, 10 versus 1. And when that one game happens to come against a rookie quarterback playing behind an offensive line that is starting three backups, and one of the starters that isn't a backup is a rookie starting left tackle, and you look at the majority of the wins that the Falcons had in this game came against those four individuals that are maybe not necessarily the most polished starting caliber offensive linemen, that is what leads credence to the idea that this is more of a one-off. But that's not to suggest that, getting sacks against Kelvin Banks or Asim Richards or whoever else don't count. They count less. But when we talk process versus results, if you understand the process, you can better predict the results, right? And so when we look at a player like James Pearce, I think this Saints game was arguably his best game after reviewing the film. I counted 7 pressures, 8 if you count the one high snapped where he was barely blocked on that particular play. But 3 of those 7 pressures or wins, 3 came against Asim Richards, the backup right tackle. 2 came against Kelvin Banks. 1 came against Cesar Ruiz, the one sort of entrenched starter for the Saints, but he's always been, in my opinion, a middling right guard. And then one of them came when Pearce was unblocked, where it basically was chipped by Juwan Johnson, the tight end, before getting a pressure on Tyler Shuck. And then you go back to Pearce's other best games this season, I would argue, week 1 versus Tampa Bay, week 2 against Minnesota, he also benefited in those games from facing backup tackles with Tristan Wirfs and Christian Darrisaw out of the lineup. Now, again, does that mean that James Pearce's production in those games counts less? No. This is the norm in the NFL. Good players beat up on bad players, right? This was true of Vic Beasley and Jack McKinley in a lot of their early career success here in Atlanta, coming mostly against lesser tackles or backup tackles. This is the norm in the NFL. When you look at the vast majority of sack production and pressure production, it comes against lower tier tackles, right? And especially for young pass rushers, this is important, right? That jump in competition that we see with pass rushers and offensive linemen going from college to the pros, right? In college, pass rushers can kind of get away without athleting guys because the tackles tend to be less top tier athletes in the college level, and their technique is generally not very good at the collegiate level. And then in the pros, these starting caliber offensive linemen typically are better athletes, and that closes that gap in terms of the being able to out athlete guys. And then if you're going to be an established starter in this league and not just kind of a backup or lesser guy, you really need your technique to be on point, and that also matches up. And so that's why when we talk about young pass rushers and drafting pass rushers high, we say you got to bet on the traits, because your traits, your athleticism is pretty much going to get you through those early years as you, as a pass rusher yourself, master the technique to catch up with the offensive tackles that are now entrenched in the league that have mastered their technique. And that's part of the reason why, like, I'm not as ready as others to declare James Pearce to be this home run pick, at least just yet. Because right now, I think how he's performing is kind of, it's probably above expectation, but not too far above expectation, right? Now, if we get this version of James Pearce that showed up against the Saints, continuing to show up the rest of the season, or even 80% of the version that we saw against the Saints continue to show up for the rest of the year, I think we're going to be having a very different conversation 6 weeks from now about, whether James Pearce has outshined expectations than we are sitting here today. But, I don't think a lot of people remember Vic Beasley and Takk McKinley's early careers, or at least their memories of their early careers are clouded by, those guys, after year 1, year 2, and sort of not living up to the hype. It's clouded by that, right? And that's, to me, kind of the interesting thing with James Pearce, right? Especially when we talk about, the trade up and whether it's worked out or not. And you looked at Vic Beasley, right? Solid year 1, big year 2 jump for him, obviously leading the NFL in sacks in year 2. And then you saw Vic Beasley kind of level off. Then Takk McKinley, solid year 1, like 7 sacks as a rookie, big year 2 jump for him. And then you sort of saw Takk McKinley level off. And so that's why, like, I'm reluctant to sort of be like, oh yeah, James Pearce is definitely a home run of a draft pick, because, like, if he's going to outshine Vic Beasley and Takk McKinley, like, I think he's off to a solid start in year 1. Hopefully we'll see a big year 2 jump. And then, to me, the question on whether or not he's just going to be another Vic or another Takk is, does he level off in year 3 and beyond, right? And again, I know that makes me sound like a hater, right? But I just feel like it's far too premature at this point in time to sort of declare, as so many have, that the Falcons have won that trade. To me, at this point, it's a wait and see sort of situation. I think games like this make you more excited about the future of James Pearce if, again, this becomes the norm moving forward. So, I'm sure we'll continue talking about that trade as the weeks go on, as we see where the Falcons ultimately pick and whatnot, and we'll see how this pass rush trends in terms of that. And so I think great game for James Pearce. We'll talk more a little bit about James Pearce, but I do want to turn the attention to guys like Ruke Orhorhoro and Brandon Dorlus, who I thought also had arguably their best games of the season against the Saints. And to me, a similar conversation on whether or not we can expect this to continue trending moving forward, and how that potentially can really help the Falcons in the coming weeks win some football games. And we'll break that down as we continue today's Locked On Falcons.
Today's show is brought to you by our friends over there at Peloton. Look, folks, it's time to break through the busiest time of the year with a brand new Peloton cross-training Tread Plus that's powered by Peloton IQ. It's Peloton's most elevated technology and equipment yet that gives you real-time guidance, and it gives you endless ways to move, whether you want to work out by yourself or if you want to work out with your favorite instructor, like my personal favorite, Alex Toussaint. He always gets me fired up to tackle the day. And the thing I like about Peloton, it helps me achieve more in less times. They have features that help you plan, stay motivated, track your progress, and Peloton IQ also provides personalized workout plans and recommendations. That's something that I use right now during the busiest time of the year covering the NFL. They plan my workouts for me based on my mood, my vibe, and also my favorite instructors. So make sure you check it out and use it because it also helps you correct your form in real time and it maximizes your reps. It counts your reps so that you can do it smarter, safer, and more efficient. Let yourself run, lift, flex, push, and go. Explore the new Peloton cross-training Tread Plus at onepeloton.com.
And today's episode is also brought to you by Georgia Access. Have your health or family needs changed lately? Well, Georgia's got you covered. Georgia Access is our state's marketplace for Georgians to compare, apply, and enroll in health insurance plans that offer the best value for their individual needs. Open enrollment is happening right now. Visit georgiaaccess.gov today. Georgia Access, health insurance for Georgia by Georgia. So I want to thank you guys once again, all of the everydayers out there, and even those of you that are casuals, right? You have contributed as well. And that is contributing to the Locked On Podcast Network being the number one sports podcast on the planet, in the galaxy. So now, everydayers, insiders know that I thought the week 4 game against Washington was Brandon Dorlus' best game as a pass rusher. I would say that this game is now a close second. I would also have no problem proclaiming this game as Ruke Orhorhoro, the Saints game, as Ruke Orhorhoro's best game as a pass rusher. Now, based off my charting, Dorlus had 7 pressures in this game. Now, 2 of those were cleanup plays, including a sack. One was a stunt. One was a play where Shuck scrambled and he got pressure on that particular play, sort of another similar cleanup play. Ruke had 3 pressures in this game, all of them coming in the final 90 seconds of this game. And one of those was a stunt. So Ruke finished strong in this game after a relatively quiet start in this game. And to me, what's interesting about these two guys is I feel like the narrative around both of these players and their performances this year is kind of being misled by certain data points, right? Like you look at Brandon Dorlus, currently in the lead with 6 sacks for the team, but a large percentage of those sacks, in my opinion, are cleanup sacks, including one against the Saints. Where a cleanup sack is essentially where another player generates a pressure and that prompts the quarterback often to sort of step up and escape the pocket or try to. And then in Dorlus's case, he basically cleans it up. And then you have the sort of misleading data with Ruke, which is based off of the GPS data, which you find at Next Gen Stats, which I know early in the season, I don't think it's still the case. Early in the season, he was the NFL's most productive interior pass rusher based off of his pressure rate, based off of the GPS data. I don't think that's not true anymore. However, I do think looking up the numbers earlier today, it was notable to me that if you at least you focus on the guys that have rushed on the interior more than 100 times this year, Zach Harrison actually is the number one pressure guy. And while I don't know if I would say Zach Harrison is the best interior pass rusher in the NFL, I don't think that's probably an accurate statement. I do think that's probably more closer to the truth based off because I think Harrison has consistently been the team's most effective interior pass rusher this year. Now, obviously, his season may be over. We'll see. He's on IR with a knee issue. I'm a little bit more optimistic that he will come back than normally I am on these podcasts, where basically my mantra is like, if you're on IR, I'm going to assume you're out for the season until I hear otherwise. But we'll see on Zach Harrison in 4 weeks. And, you know, one of the benefits, all this to say, one of the benefits of charting defense myself is that it's much easier for me to quantify or really qualify things as opposed to just simply quantifying where you're assuming every sack and pressure is created equal when they're not, right? And a lot of Ruke's early production that led to that GPS data being so high was coming on the stunts. And, you know, a lot of Dorlus's current production is coming on cleanup plays. And Locked On Falcons insiders know I broke this down for them after the Colts game, where I charted pressures as all the pressures I've charted myself this year as wins. And one of the things I've been trying to track this year is a quote unquote true win rate, which is basically trying his best to remove scheme, you know, taking out all the unblocked pressures, the stunts, the cleanup plays, the plays where they're chasing down a scrambling quarterback, all those things, to basically see how often is a guy winning himself by beating the blocker ahead of him, or is it circumstances and scheme that is allowing that guy to win? And at least from weeks 5 through 10, Dorlus's win rate, even though he got 3 sacks during that span of games, was 1.2%. And I didn't track true win rate last year, but for the sake of comparison, Lorenzo Carter's true win rate last year would have been 2%. All right. So 1.2% is below Lorenzo Carter. So that's basically telling you that a lot of that production that Dorlus was getting during that middle stretch of the season, the second quarter, I guess you could say, was not necessarily him beating guys. And so you've heard sentiment from myself, Jarvis Davis, and others in that period of time being like, oh, Dorlus is coming along nicely. And again, that was my initial perception. And so I actually sat down and crunched the numbers. And to me, that doesn't necessarily hold up as much under scrutiny. So to me, this New Orleans, all that to say, this Saints game for Dorlus to have the type of performance that he had, even if he was benefiting somewhat from scheme and cleanups and all that stuff, but the fact that he was able to get 3 legit wins in this game, to me, was a welcome change for him, especially when we look ahead to the matchups that the Falcons are going to have to deal with in the coming weeks, the Jets, the Seahawks, the Bucs, right? Because all 3 of those teams, relatively speaking, have pretty solid offensive tackles, right? The weaknesses in terms of their pass protection is on the interior at the guard, center guard spots for all 3 of those teams. And so to me, if the Falcons are going to continue to win with 4 rushers, they're going to need more from their interior guys like they got in the Saints game from Dorlus and Ruke. And I know you're probably sitting there going like, well, you're being a little hypocritical, Aaron, because you spent the first 10 minutes of the podcast being all skeptical about James Pearce beating lesser tackles. And, now, you're talking about the level up in competition that he's going to face and being skeptical of him. And meanwhile, Ruke and Dorlus, you're saying like, go and beat up on bad guards. And you're saying like, keep going. And it's like, yes, because, based on the conclusion, the Falcons took an advantage of a favorable matchup against the Saints. And I think if this 4-man pass rush is going to continue to have success, it's going to have to continue to take advantage of favorable matchups against future opponents, right? To me, a big part of that is my belief that football is a game of matchups. The outcomes of games are determined by who wins the majority of matchups, right? And if you're presented favorable matchups, you need to take advantage of those matchups, right? And so even though I was quote unquote complaining about Pearce, which I wasn't, to me in the Saints game, Pearce, Ruke, and Dorlus and others, not alone, but we're just focusing on those guys won their matchups. And that's why the Falcons were able to win the Saints game, right? That's 1,000% is what I believe, right? That winning those matchups was a big contributing factor to why the Falcons won the game. However, when you start looking beyond them winning the matchups and thus how it impacts their ability to win the game, and you start saying, well, now they've won the trade because James Pearce won the matchups, or this player is destined to be a star in this league because they won the matchups in this one game, that's where I'm like, pump the brakes. So that's more of what I was trying to get across with James Pearce when you talk about the big picture things with him having this great game against the Saints. What does that mean for his future? It's like, well, that has yet to be determined. Right. And so to me, these young players and these young pass rushers are a big reason that the Falcons beat the Saints. The question is, are they going to be a big reason why the Falcons can beat the Jets, the Seahawks, the Bucs, the Cardinals, the Rams, all that stuff? And so we're going to have answers to those questions over the next 6 weeks. The answers to the other questions about, did they win the trade? Is this guy going to be a star? Like, to me, those questions aren't going to be answered until like 2 or 3 years from now. And so that's why like I tend to push back on that element of it. When we talk about the week to week of the league, yes, go ham, right? Buy into the hype, all you want to do, right? Hype is a hell of a drug, right? This is why fans always gaslight themselves every offseason that, hey, despite the fact that this team wins less than, 9 has a losing record every single season, this year is going to be different because they're going to win 12 games this year, all that stuff. So I get why people love to buy the hype. And to me, that's what, the conversation about the trade and future stardom is just hype at this point in time, not real substance. But we'll leave that conversation aside and wrap up today's episode talking about the run game. And how do we exactly interpret the fact that Tyler Allgeier outshined Bijan Robinson as a rusher under center? And talking about continuing trends, if the Falcons continue this trend of operating more under center, if that leads to Allgeier outshining Bijan for the rest of the season, does that make Bijan more expendable as a possible trade candidate after the season? And we'll get into all of that as we wrap up today's Locked On Falcons. Now, guys, the NBA season is back, and there's no better place to get in on the action than with FanDuel, the official sports betting partner of the NBA. As I sit here recording, the Hawks are struggling against the Washington Wizards, but even if you missed opening tip-off or you just want to ride the hot hand, FanDuel is the perfect opportunity for you to have all those live bets on whether or not the Hawks are going to score next or whether or not they're going to make an epic second half or fourth quarter comeback. Plus, you can combine those live bets into a same game parlay for a shot at a bigger payout. And if you're not just into the NBA, you can check out the NFL and so many other sports over at FanDuel. If you're curious about this upcoming Falcons-Jets matchup where James Pearce Jr. and Ruke Orhorhoro and all those guys are going to really shine, the Falcons are favored by 2.5 points. So if you feel great about these young pass rushers, go take the Falcons on the points over at FanDuel. And right now, new customers will get $300 in bonus bets if your first $5 bet wins. So use it on the Falcons, use it on the Hawks, use it on something else. Just head on over to FanDuel.com to sign up and download the app and play your game with FanDuel, the official sports betting partner of the NBA. So we know one of the big changes against the Saints was the Falcons' ample use of under center offense for the first time ever in the Zach Robinson era. Right. And, we've discussed quite a bit over the last, 48 hours about how much of that is due to Kirk Cousins being better at that or more comfortable than that. And obviously the question is going to be, will this trend continue for the remaining 6 games with Kirk as the Falcons starting quarterback? Not really interested in having more conversations about that. I want to talk about the running game. So if you missed yesterday's episode, I mentioned how Tyler Allgeier was more productive running from under center than Bijan Robinson was against the Saints, right? Allgeier averaged more than 3 yards per carry and had a 45% success rate rushing the football under center, while Bijan barely averaged 2 yards per carry and had a 29% success rate. And of course, we're wondering, will this trend continue? Now, mentioned how one of the reasons why the Falcons sort of have centered their offense previously on the pistol is not just about the quarterback, Kirk versus Penix, but also the running back, which Bijan, being more effective in that scheme. Now, this game represents one data point, but even if the sample size is small, this trend of Allgeier being slightly better under center has been generally true throughout this season, going even into last Sunday, right? On under center runs prior to this Sunday, Allgeier was averaging 3.5 yards per carry. Now, Bijan was averaging 3.9 yards per carry on under center runs. But, that's one of the issues with yards per carry where, especially on a small sample size, it can be heavily skewed by one big run. And I think Bijan had like a 15-yard run against somebody under center. That I think is why that number is skewed. And so you look at success rate, which is much more of a measure of down to down, snap to snap consistency and efficiency with running the football. Allgeier under center going into Sunday was 77% successful, and Bijan was 56% successful. Both good numbers, but obviously Allgeier again outshining Bijan. Now, to be fair, the Falcons mostly get under center prior to this past Sunday when they're either in short yardage situations, goal line situations, whether they're backed up at their own 5 or at the opposing team's 5. Like I think 68% of their under center runs prior to the Saints game came in one of those situations. So those situations tend to be more quote unquote smash mouth situations. And I think that makes sense why Allgeier is a little bit better in those specific situations. So again, the question is going to be, will this trend continue over the next 6 weeks? But I bring this up because over the last week, you scroll through Twitter looking for news and whatnot, and then you just see some tweets from time to time, and you wonder if it's a bit, right? But a lot of commentary last week about when we were talking about a reset and rebuilding, coming off that Panthers loss, of trading Bijan, right? And again, I don't know if this is a bit, but I've seen some people suggesting that the Falcons, instead of letting Tyler Allgeier walk this offseason, since he's a free agent, is to re-sign Allgeier and then try to trade Bijan after that point. And so, we're going to talk about this more as a thought experiment than necessarily like this is exactly what the Falcons should do. I tend to not try to do that in November. I try to wait till January, February to construct off-season plans and strategies once it's all played out. But let's get into the thought experiment. And I think there's some logic to the idea of keeping Allgeier and moving Bijan. I think there's some logic to it. I want to stress some small amount of logic to it. Right? It's not some completely irrational take, right? Because if you're imagining a scenario where the Falcons continue the under center offense, this trend continues of Allgeier outshining Bijan, continues over the next 6 weeks, and then for whoever you think is the new coordinator or the same coordinator in the Falcons adopt a much more traditional under center rushing attack next year. And again, this very much remains to be seen. But if you figure you could probably re-sign Allgeier for, let's say, $7 million a year. And then you look at Bijan's impending contract, and he's next in line after Drake to get paid. Drake could get paid this offseason, and then Bijan will get paid the following offseason in 2027. Right now we're trending towards Bijan costing over $20 million a year to keep, right? So let's say $21 million just to give us, 7 and 21 round numbers. And so if your argument, the logic is, Allgeier, if you think Allgeier can give you, say, 75% the player that Bijan is, which may be generous depending on who you ask. But if you say Allgeier can give you 75% the player that Bijan is and only cost you 33% the price, again, that's the logic behind that. And so the idea of if you could trade Bijan, let's say, for a top 50 pick, maybe a late first, maybe an early second, right, plus another mid-round pick, which seems to be the going rate for a premier running back like him, right? And so the argument would be, the logic is Allgeier plus 2, starting caliber players in the draft, which would be the case with those 2 draft picks. 3 players are better than 1, right? There's logic to that. I don't necessarily know if I prescribe to that logic, just because I think trading star players in their primes like Bijan Robinson would be in this scenario, and other examples of that are Christian McCaffrey, Jalen Ramsey, Khalil Mack. You now have that situation potentially with Sauce Gardner or Quinnen Williams. Rarely does the team that moves on from those players benefit from it, right? It's different examples, but like you just see that with the Matt Ryan and Julio Jones trades. Now, granted, they were stars past their primes, but the Falcons netted D'Angelo Malone in the Matt Ryan trade and Troy Anderson in the Julio trade. And it just kind of illustrates how much of a crapshoot the draft is, that your chances of hitting on a home run with a star player, even, replacing one that's past their prime, is not in your favor. And even if you manage to get a first round pick with, in a trade for Bijan Robinson, your chances of finding a good player with that pick is probably like 60, 70%, probably, a solid starter for you. But your chances of finding a player that's on par with Bijan Robinson is definitely less than 5%, right? And, if you just base this off of the Locked On Podcast Network Top 100, where Bijan was the 34th overall player, and you could argue Bijan was, I argued it, and so I'm sure many of you would agree with me that was too low for Bijan. But if he's the 34th best player in the entire NFL, that would mean that he's a 98th percentile player. So that, in theory, would mean your chances of finding a player that's as good or better than Bijan is less than 2% with any draft pick, right? And so that's why I think, you can make a case that you could benefit from trading Bijan, but it's not a very compelling case, right? To me, if you're going to make a case, if I was to make a case for Bijan, it's not because I think the Falcons will benefit from it. It's just simply because, well, they're floundering, right? It's basically the idea, like, say in 2027, they're floundering, they're struggling, they have no direction. And do you want to sit there and make Bijan the highest paid running back, potentially on a backloaded deal, those first 3 years of relatively cheap money that you're giving Bijan as potentially the highest paid running back in the NFL that is workable before you have to start restructuring contracts, where his contract is relatively cap friendly. And if you're a bad team, if you're winning like 4 or 5 games in those years, you're just kind of wasting money at that point, and you're wasting his prime. And so we've talked about the idea of the Falcons doing a reset after this season, without getting into the nitty gritty of that. The Cliff Notes version of that is, I think the Falcons potentially could reset after this season, kind of take a step back in 2026 rather than pushing for the playoffs, right? Position yourself to pick high in the 27 draft. Hopefully you get a quarterback, right? I don't think you can move, this was a talking point on the podcast last week, but I think you'll struggle to move forward as an organization with Michael Penix as your plan A at quarterback. And so I think your plan A now has to kind of be who you can nab in 2027. Now, does that guarantee that plan A is going to come to fruition? Absolutely not. But that's a conversation for another day. So you take that step back in 2026 to set up yourself, position yourself to land a good quarterback in 2027. You go through your growing pains of that rookie quarterback starting in 2027, and you hope that rookie in 2028 has a big year 2 jump. Similar to what we've seen with Drake May this year. And now all of a sudden you're a playoff team in 2028 and you keep Bijan all this time, basically to kind of be the Michael Turner to that young quarterback's Matt Ryan, right? Similar to how we thought Bijan would be that for Michael Penix. And while it's not to say that can't happen moving forward, I just don't know how reliable a strategy that is at this point with Penix missing very valuable development time due to coming off this injury. But what's interesting about the Turner-Ryan comparison, like if you look at Turner's contract that we gave him in 2008 and you adjusted it for salary cap inflation to $2025, Michael Turner's 2008 contract would be roughly the equivalent of like $15 million a year in $2025. So not that far from, potentially $20 million, if you adjust to what the cap is probably going to be in 2027, which is probably going to be like, I don't know, $320 million or something like that. It's probably going to be around closer to $20 million or whatever it is. So it's kind of a similar situation where it's like, keep Bijan, he's the Michael Turner, get another quarterback, he's Matt Ryan, and blossom from there, right? But, I'm still waiting on Arthur Blank to give me that phone call to bring me in as a consultant in order to enact these plans. But in the meantime, guys, that's going to do it for us here. I hope you continue to make this podcast your first listen each and every day so that you can continue to support me and other shows like this on the Locked On Podcast Network until I get that phone call. In addition to all the things we talked about on today's episode, for the Locked On Falcons insiders, they will get not only this audio version or video version of the podcast that the rest of you are getting, they also will get a film breakdown, an actual breakdown of the film from this Saints game. So we'll be looking at the young pass rushers, Pearce, Ruke, Dorlus, in addition to Walker Watts, maybe AK will also make a cameo in that. We'll talk about, how and why Bijan got outshined by Allgeier and sort of what was the mechanisms of that. And if that's something, we'll take a deeper dive in that. And then, of course, we'll break down Kirk Cousins under center and the play action passing. And one of the things that I know I will be talking about for the Locked On Falcons insiders is they gave Kirk checkdowns now. They weren't doing that last year when they would run play action last year. And that, to me, was a contributing factor to Kirk forcing some things that led to some critical mistakes in the latter half of the season. And so that's one big change, and we'll break down some of the other things. And so that will be available for the Locked On Falcons insiders. And the beautiful thing is, if you join now, you can check that out all for free, right? You get a 14-day free trial, then $4.99 a month by becoming an insider at the link in the description below at joinsubtext.com/LockedOnFalcons. So go check it out. Continue to make Locked On Falcons your first listen. Check us out each and every day on YouTube or wherever you listen to podcasts. Check out the Locked On NFL podcast to get you guys geared up for the rest of this week, right? We'll be back tomorrow here on Locked On Falcons with a crossover Thursday with Locked On Jets. And then we'll see. I'm not planning on dropping an episode on Black Friday, but we'll see. Maybe things change. Maybe, something comes up and I'm like, well, got to talk about that. But that is the plan for us moving forward. So continue to make Locked On Falcons your first listen. It's all part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.